Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Don Shelley, your host. Once again, we appreciate you giving us some of your time today and joining us for today's episode, where we're going to be going not that far back in the magical what-if time machine. Only going to go back a little more than a decade ago. But I think we'll discover today as we talk through this historical what-if, this fork in time, that sometimes it doesn't take long for some things to have a major impact on society, and thus if they don't happen, also having a substantial impact by what is missing. Today, our historical what-if is going to consider what would have happened if smartphones had not come to be in the last part of the first decade of the 21st century. You might think of that as being maybe described as there is no iPhone, although while the iPhone is considered by many to be the first quote-unquote smartphone, it's not the only entrant there. And so one of the things that we'll even talk about today on the what if is if there had been no iPhone, would there have been a smartphone? But suddenly the impact of the iPhone and its coming to market in 2007 is a major milestone in modern technology and has had a tremendous impact on how communications work, and then just a number of other things that work around that just in a slightly more than 10 years since we came to understand that a phone could be so much more than just a phone, the one that we're carrying around. Actually, probably something that we need to do before we get too much further down the path of exploring this historical what-if. The what-if of the smartphone not coming into existence is really understanding the background and even the definition of what we mean by smartphone. For a lot of folks, that begins with a device that they are most familiar with that is represented by the iPhone, which was introduced in 2007 by Apple, or shortly thereafter, the types of devices that came to be known as Android devices that were produced by, using the Google operating system, that were produced by a number of different manufacturers. In the world today, the smartphone world today, things tend to be divided into two camps: the iPhone or iOS, that's describing the operating system that works on the iPhone environment, and then the Android environment, which is the operating system that was created by Google, which runs on a variety of different phone manufacturers, including Samsung and other major manufacturers that have worked well in the Android market. So when we think of smartphone, we're thinking about the capacitive touch screen, iconic, be it an iPhone or be it a Samsung, for example, that is represented by interacting with the phone, not with a stylus and not with a keyboard or a keypad, but actually interacting with a touch screen on the phone. That's what most people would think of when we think of smartphone today, and that's for the purpose of this podcast, what we will focus around is the evolution of that form of smartphone. But it is important to note that in the decades preceding 2007 and the advent of what we call a smartphone today, there were a number of other quote-unquote smartphones, smart devices, phones that had other types of operating systems or other ways of interacting, or other ways of interacting that then had phone capability built into them. So we'll talk a little bit about that as background so that we can understand how things might have worked differently in the what-if timeline. As we talk about so often here on the podcast, it's important to really understand the what did in order to be able to explore the what-if. So the what did of the phone side of the smartphone definition actually goes back really looking in terms of mobile telephony, mobile telephone capability, sort of goes back into while there were radio telephones that were used that go back into the 50s and 60s, it's really in the 1970s and then moving into the 1980s that we see the development of what we know as being cellular technology. Cellular being different from mobile telephones or just mobile technology. This is the first mobile telephones were radio telephones. The cellular technology began to use the idea of using smaller areas for transmission and multiple towers to create the networks, these cellular networks that we think of today. And it's during the 1980s that these are first deployed. The first generation, the 1G generation of this, happens beginning often in Europe, particularly the Nordic areas. Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden were among the first to have these type of networks put in place. Then they were slowly but surely adopted into the United States. Throughout the early part of the 1990s, the idea of digital cellular networks came into being, and thus cell phones became much more common. They started to move away from being the bulky devices or the devices that were just fixed or mounted in cars. Some of you that are old enough, you may remember the Motorola bag phone, which is a way of having a portable phone, a cell phone, but certainly not something that was clipped to your hip. It gave you the ability to take and move the phone from one vehicle to another, because many of the early cell phones were still fixed place deployments inside of a vehicle. But as the technology improved and the phones became smaller and smaller, moving away from the quote-unquote Motorola brick phones, for those of you who know what that is. If not, I encourage you to take a quick tour on the internet about the history of cellular phone technology, and you'll see how it's evolved. We actually find ourselves in the early 1990s with the idea of a wearable cell phone becoming much more common. So some of the major manufacturers here, Nokia, are making their style of phone more of a block or brick style phone, but now small enough to put into a pocket or to be able to clip on a belt. Motorola comes out with their flip phone, the StarTAC flip phone, sort of harkening back, if you will, to the days or a form factor maybe first made popular by the original Star Trek television series in terms of its communicator device and the way that it flipped open to be able to talk, such that by the time of the early to mid-1990s, cell phones are becoming a more common thing for everyone, particularly in the developed world, to have on their hip and to be able to be reached and to have that capability exist. At the same time, those who are very much involved in technology are also using other types of devices that aren't cell phones in conjunction with that. And so we have the rise of what are known as the PDAs, or personal digital assistants. And you can go back and look at the history of digital assistants going back primarily until to the early 90s with development of things like Apple's Newton, with some of the developments by what eventually became the Palm operating system, so things like Palm Pilots. The first version of a Windows-type device, which is originally known as Windows Mobile, becomes the Pocket PC. And so you have a number of different standards that are out there for a handheld personal digital assistant, something to do calendaring functions, to be able to do keep contacts and keep records. So this is on the rise, and so many people were carrying two separate devices. They were carrying a PDA, whatever that form might be, a Palm device, maybe it's a Windows device, Windows CE, a Pocket PC as it would come to be known, or it may be one of the other types of the number of different devices that were out there. There were many different operating systems and many different types of devices, and then separate from that they would have their phone, which was also growing ever and ever smaller. Eventually, as we reach the early to mid-1990s, there becomes a desire to have these two things be able to merge together. In other words, I'm already carrying a device on my hip that I use and has become economically feasible to use on a regular basis, known as a cell phone, and I have a separate device, a PDA, which contains information. I'd like the two things to be able to talk or act together. And so what we find, particularly by the mid-90s, we start seeing devices that marry those two things together. And so these are sort of the first things that might be the precursors of what will become a smartphone. They are PDA phone hybrids. And so you have things like devices such as the Handspring Trio, which combined the Palm operating system, one of the PDA-type devices, with a GSM phone, and gave it the ability. That was in 2002, so you can carry one device that was both a phone and your Palm Pilot through the Trio. Nokia came out with a series of things that used its Symbian platform, which was one of the competing PDA devices. There were the early releases by some of the folks, Motorola being some who incorporated the Windows PC, the Pocket PC style version of a mobile operating system into their phones, and so you had these various types of Windows-based PDAs that were also now connected with cell phones. And so we begin to see this merging. These are now bulkier devices, but they're starting to serve a purpose because these are primarily for business individuals who need the ability to do both, have a phone call capability, but also have the ability to access email. Sort of the next thing that comes along, and maybe even do some limited web browsing. We won't spend a lot of time talking about mobile web browsing before it is what we know it today, but there were operating systems and protocols, for example, like the WAP browsing, which is a simplified text version of browsing, or being able to interact with the internet without pictures, not HTML, not what we think of today as being a full-blown browser, but the ability to get information off of the internet and interact with information on a device which was much more keyboard focused and was much simpler in terms of being a phone type device. What ultimately does come along that becomes a game changer, though, again in the mid-1990s, a company called Research in Motion that had a product that they called the BlackBerry. And where the BlackBerry sort of changed things more than anything else, particularly in the business environment, was it was a platform that was designed that could be used as a phone, but was also very, very, very capable of being a mobile email device. In fact, one of the things that you'll see, BlackBerry being the name of the device, by 2006, the folks who are really using those devices sometimes refer to it as their crackberry. We'll come back to this, how the impact of smartphones moves forward, particularly in the alternate timeline here. It was very addictive for folks who needed access to their email and need to be available with a mobile phone. By the time we reach 2005, 2006, the BlackBerry device is out there. We're beginning to see something that has more of the practical use functionality of what eventually will become the smartphone. Certainly at this time, you have phones that are getting smaller and smaller, and they're beginning to incorporate things like cameras. They're beginning to incorporate limited abilities to play music. And you have manufacturers like Nokia who are producing cellular telephones at tremendous, tremendous scale. And we also have the rise of text messaging, SMS messaging, becoming a big part of what's going on here. And so the setting in the mid-1990s is in the mid-2000s, is that we have the beginning of the merging, not the merging only the merging of the devices, but the development of the devices such that there is now a desire to have one device that's a portable, carryable device by especially business people, but also now by consumers to be able to do a multitude of things, not just make and take phone calls, the original thing that everyone wanted to be able to do by having a cell phone. Cellular plans are becoming cheaper and cheaper, so it's much more practical to actually use a cell phone on a regular basis. And these PDA, personal digital assistant type functionalities, maintaining calendars and contacts and very limited web browsing and email are starting to be built into the phones as well. Now, the data networks that are associated with the cell phones and that are transmitting the voice traffic are not really capable of generating or dealing with the amount of bandwidth that's required to do something more than that. And so the technology, while it has evolved and is getting smaller and smaller and cooler to those that are in the technical world, is not quite to the point of being able to support what we think of today as being full-blown smartphone functionality. Moving slightly forward, though, we have a very powerful player in the technology world. That's Apple, who has revolutionized a number of things, the PC world prior to that, but has also brought digital music in the form of the iPod to a tremendous place. And so a project gets kicked off inside of Apple for them to consider producing a phone. And initially that's a project that is not given a great deal of support from Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple. He sort of views the phone as not being the way that things should go, but a team was put together and they eventually produced some of the early prototypes and the early concepts of what will become the first iPhone. And in many ways, the first iPhone is a digital touchscreen version of their popular iPod music player that has also now had the functionality built in to be able to be a phone. So bringing those two devices together, particularly the desire of people to be able to carry music around and have music on a portable basis. What really changes the game, though, and this will become our point of departure, is assuming that we never actually see what happens as a result of the smartphone coming to be the true smartphone, an iPhone or an Android device, is that now there's a realization that in addition to being a phone, in addition to being a portable music player, this device can also be something that takes advantage fully of what's going on with the internet and the ability to transmit data back and forth. And so our fork in time, where we're going to break the departure here, is assuming that we continued to evolve along the lines of a device similar, let's say, to a BlackBerry or a mobile phone-equipped Palm Pilot or a Windows CE device, Pocket PC device, a Symbian device, but we actually don't have the evolutionary jump, at least at that time, that moves us to the smartphone that we're accustomed to today, that uses a touch screen as its interactive way of functioning, and it doesn't have the data networks that back it up to make that possible. As a final sort of point to make in setting the background, again, I'm using the concept here of the iPhone being the first true, what we'll consider modern smartphone. Again, we've already talked about these hybrid devices that had come to be before that. It is in 2007 that we have the Apple release of the iPhone. It's a very short period of time later. The response to the iPhone is the Open Handset Alliance, or OHA, which is led by Google. This brings HTC, Sony, Dell, Motorola, Samsung, LG, the major players in what we think of today as being the Android market, into play. And so Apple releases the iPhone using the iOS operating system in January of 2007. The Open Handset Alliance is announced in response to that in November of 2007, and the first Android phones that use the system that comes out of the OHA, out of this group that's led by Google, are released in late 2008. They're released in October of 2008. So 2007, 2008 marks our point of departure, and we're going to assume, for just the ease of a departure point here, that Apple does not introduce the iPhone, because I think it's very easy to see, while there had been some move towards some more interactive types of screens for BlackBerry devices and other types of things, it's with the establishment of the iPhone and it becoming a hit in the marketplace that we have the response from Google and the other manufacturers to be able to counter that, and that's what produces the Android, and that's what produces the iPhone Android sort of format wars that we've enjoyed over the last decade in terms of those competing technologies that are consistently advancing smartphone technology as they are competing with each other. So our point of departure today, taking a while for us to get here, is actually going to be 2007. Apple does not introduce the iPhone. So if we look down that path, how would things be different? Well, first of all, you wouldn't have the device that we know today. And the iPhone, most notably, the change that it made was not just in changing the form factor for how a combination device would work, but it became a platform that suddenly allowed the use of applications that were built on that platform to be there. And so I remember my first iPhone and thinking, this is not even so much a phone. Phone is just one of the applications that exists inside of this, but this is a device that's designed to deliver apps. In fact, very quickly after that, we suddenly developed language, new things that came into our vocabulary, talking about the App Store, or there's an app for that, there's an application for that. And while there had been programs that had run before in the various operating systems that were on the personal digital assistants, the PDAs, they were nowhere close to being as universal and ubiquitous and as powerful as what the iPhone and then later the Android phones would bring to the table. And so suddenly you actually now had really a portable computing device that was primarily a phone, and that's still primarily the way that it was being delivered, and was connected to a phone network, which was also going to be its data network. But more important than that was the ability to deliver these very customized types of programs that were easy to interact with on the phone. And because of the nature of the screen, the nature of the touch capability, things that we're accustomed to doing today, not being able to squeeze, to zoom in and zoom out on web browsing, those are the changes that first generation smartphone brings along, the iPhone and then later the Android phones that follow. And so suddenly we move from a mobile telephone. We still call them our mobile phones, but really they are so much more than a phone, and they are used for so much more than a phone. In fact, the bulk of the data that exists between cellular handsets, between our iPhones and our Android phones today and the networks, by far the vast majority of the data is not actual voice traffic. It's actually the data traffic that's going back and forth either with mobile web browsing or the other things that are connecting to the internet through the apps that are on the phone, the small programs that do the various functions, be they games or be they something like Uber, for example, that's transmitting data back and forth between the smartphone and a central server and delivering something of value to the user. In fact, one of the major things you can think about there is imagine a world where you didn't have a smartphone. Remember, smartphones then also became equipped with various GPS functionality. GPS was a separate device. Even handheld GPSs existed, but they didn't interact with your phone system. Think about Uber as being the example of one of the major things that's changed over the last 10 years as a result of the smartphone. You now have a device that can show a map. You have a device that has an application, so there's an Uber app on your phone. You can click on that app and through the capabilities of the phone, relay to a remote computer somewhere your exact location using GPS, and you can conduct a commercial transaction that says, I need to go from place A to place B. You know where I'm at place A. Dispatch a driver to me, and we will take care of all the financial aspects of this transaction, not by me giving money to this driver or him having to process a credit card or some other form of payment, but actually because of the way that we're connected and he knows or she knows where to go and find me because of their mobile device, we're able to have a third party take care of the financial exchange between us. And so what goes on with Uber is very much dependent upon the existence of the smartphone. You have to have all of the capabilities that exist in this smartphone that goes above and beyond the capabilities that were there in the PDA handset hybrids in order to be able to do this and do this at an effective level. If you don't have a smartphone, it's very easy to argue that you might not have anything that looks like Uber today. Something similar to it may have eventually developed, but it probably would have been very much slower in terms of developing. It's hard to imagine how you would have a ubiquitous atmosphere, electronic atmosphere, computer atmosphere for an application to be able to use regardless of device, which is what we have now between the two competing systems, between iOS, the system on the iPhone, and Android operating systems, which run on those platforms, on those phones, is that you have a common way for a retail situation or a commercial situation, in this case it's Uber, to be able to interact with its customers and take advantage of the technology that the actual smartphone represents to be able to connect someone who needs a service, the rider, with someone who is willing to be paid to deliver the service. That would be the Uber driver, using their own personal vehicle. Think about how disruptive Uber has been in a technology sense to traditional industries that existed and were still thriving at the time of the smartphones developing in 2007. You still had taxis, you still had limousine services, you still had shuttle buses. Those were the primary ways, public transportation systems, obviously. Those were the primary ways that people were able to move from point A to point B when they were not in their own vehicle. Now you have, through the use of technology, totally disrupted how that works, and you've actually enabled someone who really only wants to deliver a couple of rides, who doesn't want to invest in a cab, doesn't want this to be their normal way of life. They don't want to become a taxi driver. They just want to make a little money on the side by being a driver, and if they happen to be in the area, they're willing to give someone a ride. The technology that's embedded inside of Uber, and we could use other examples without a doubt, tons of other examples of the types of things that we do using apps on our smartphones today, but just using that as an example has created an entire economy. You might argue that may not be the best situation. There's arguments for and against, if you will, the gig economy or the side job economies that exist as a result of this technology, but it's clear to say that they would not have existed if it weren't for the smartphone. That change has happened recently. That change has happened within the last decade, and it's been incredibly disruptive to some existing in industries, the taxi cab industry and some of the other transportation industries that existed before, and it has also enabled an entire industry to form out of that. And if you look at the things that sort of flow from that are sort of similar to it, things like DoorDash and Grubhub and some of the other things that are also about delivering, now not people, but delivering items from one place to another, all connected by the smartphone's capability to tell a computer network very easily over the network and interact with very easily over a network for the end user, where I'm at, what I need, and to be able to conduct a commercial transaction. This is something that has just been in the last decade, and it's now a huge, huge business. In fact, in 2019, just using Uber as an example alone, their third quarter gross bookings were $3.7 billion in gross bookings, so gross revenue over the year before, totaling $16.5 billion. So the smartphone is is the mechanism by which there is now a company that has booked gross revenue of $16.5 billion in a year. And the only reason that they've been able to do that is because of the technology that brought the smartphone along. That's a tremendous impact commercially. Whether they're profitable or not, whether it's a viable thing or not, that still remains an interesting thing, because one of the most interesting things that people will point out is that it's only selectively profitable depending on how you want to look at it. And there's also the possibility that it will never be a fully profitable business, but yet is responsible for $16.5 billion worth of transactions. That would not exist were it not for the smartphone today. So one of the major things you can say that's been a shift, one of the things that would be different in this alternate fork in time where there's no smartphone, is many of the companies that we know today that have grown to be household names, household words that are producing billions of dollars each year worth of revenue would simply not exist. And so that's a fairly substantial thing to realize would be different. One of the other major things that would be different in a world where there had not been the iPhone or the smartphone would have actually been on the company that created the original iPhone. That's on Apple. As we sit here now in 2019, it fluctuates a little bit from year to year, but now approximately 60%, maybe a little bit more, of Apple's revenue, of its sales each year, come from the iPhone. So a company that was founded as a computer company that evolved into other areas, for example, with the creation of the iPod as being digital music, now is very much more not just a computer company. What it is now is a services company, and is a company that makes a product, in the case of the iPhone, that is its bread and butter. Over half of Apple's revenue, again, over 60% of their revenue, comes from iPhone sales. And that doesn't even get into the amount of revenue that flows as a result of the platform that the iPhone represents, where Apple takes a cut of transactions through their App Store for the things that are being sold on a monthly or a daily basis inside of the platform, the application universe. And so one of the things to think about in an alternative timeline is, where would Apple be if it weren't for the iPhone? Well, you might argue they would probably be doing okay. It's not that they were not a viable company before doing this, but they may have moved into other arenas. For example, Apple continues now to make efforts to move into the television market. You may have seen, if they had not focused on the iPhone or have as much involved with the iPhone and with the revenue that comes from it, they may have pushed faster into the area of Apple TV, and they may have found themselves trying to compete more earlier with companies like Netflix and Hulu that were making the transition of how media was delivered, the death of the DVD and the Blu-ray, the death of Blockbuster, and moving over to streaming services. Apple may have been, while they're certainly a part of that today, they may have been more of a part of that if they'd been focused on that instead of focused on the technology, which have never come to exist in the same way the iPhone. But there's no doubt that one of the other major forks in time is you would have a very different Apple computers today than you would then. I would argue that it would be a much smaller company. It would still be a very large company, but it would not be as large as it is today, because the iPhone has become such an important part of how it has grown to be where it is today, but also where its revenues are coming from today. So one of the winners of the actual history timeline in Apple is Apple, in terms of how it played out for them as the innovator of the iPhone. There were also losers, so there's some things that would have changed drastically in the area of business. I mentioned there in the 2006-2007 period of time, immediately before the release of the iPhone, Research in Motion, RIM, and its BlackBerry devices were probably the hottest things going without a doubt in the technology world, particularly the communication technology world. And certainly for business technology, Research in Motion and BlackBerry was the standard by which email was delivered in a corporate environment in which email was made mobile. I remember going to work for a company in 2007, and on day one, in addition to being issued my desktop computer, I was also issued my BlackBerry device, because the company's expectation was that I was going to need to be able to read and respond to email while mobile. And so it was considered just as important a part of my business apparel as business clothing would have been, and just as important as having a computer on my desk or having a notebook computer would be, was this idea that I would have a BlackBerry device that would be my cell phone or my email device that I would be using. It's not very many years later. It's a matter of 4 or 5 years as suddenly in 2007 the iPhone explodes on the scene, and then the Android explodes on the scene, and the capabilities that are just inside of those new devices to be able to deal with email just now as an application, not as a purpose-built reason for the device to exist, very quickly causes the end of BlackBerry. BlackBerry, in a matter of years, goes from being a company that's very much on the rise, that is growing at tremendous year-over-year growth rates, and the revenues that it's bringing in, goes to being a company that's on the decline, and eventually now not really, even though they still exist, much of a relevant player in the mobile communication space. And so one of the other big changes at the fork in time is the rise of Apple that we see in the real world, a smaller Apple, but we probably would have had a company like BlackBerry that would have achieved a lot of that revenue and a lot of that success that went to Apple over the last 10 years. And so one of the more interesting things to think about in the alternative timeline is what doesn't exist in the same way today. That's a company like Research in Motion, with BlackBerry being what they are. There are other manufacturers for cell phones. Nokia, for example, was one of the largest, Motorola as well, those two, the largest manufacturers of cell phones before the smartphone era. Nokia did not do a good job of transitioning from their almost unbelievable market share, something like 35% of the global market share for Nokia for handsets in the early 2000s. They did not translate well, were caught off guard by the smartphone revolution. And so as a result, Nokia, which still exists today, is nowhere near the organization that it was before. So in the alternative fork, you can imagine that Nokia may have continued to be a very much a larger player in the cellular telephone market, and may have been more of the source of innovation. They, along with Motorola, had innovated a number of the things that we thought of as being the hip, cool cell phones in the 1990s and moving into the 2000s. And so it's reasonable to believe that they might have evolved additional features or additional services that were built around what they thought of as being their core business, which was still looking at the device primarily as a phone. Nokia would have had to deal with the challenge of what BlackBerry brought, which was looking at the device not just as a phone, but also as a mode of email. Without the advent of the iPhone and subsequently the Android phone, the smartphone as we know it today, we would have a very different Nokia that would be in existence alongside a very different Research in Motion and BlackBerry. Of course, an additional difference that would happen down the alternative path of history is there would not have been a need for quite the expansion in terms of capability of the data capacity of cellular networks. When cellular networks were originally deployed, they were deployed with the idea of being able to deliver one primary thing in terms of data, and that's the voice of callers back and forth. In fact, the first networks were analog in terms of how they function. And later they would become digital networks, but still the bandwidth required to be able to transmit voice is very different than what is required today by the modern smartphone, particularly the applications that we run on a modern smartphone. And so while we do have some of the early elements of the 3G network, the third generation network that is coming along at the time of 2007 when the current concept of the smartphone that we're using here today for our purposes comes into being, that was more than adequate to carry back and forth voice traffic, even in saturated areas, to be able to do the limited amount of, to some degree, email or other type of low bandwidth text type data applications that would go back and forth, wireless application protocol browsing, the types of things that were not full-blown multimedia. What we find now is we have a very different type of cellular network because the cellular network is primarily designed to deliver data at high rates, high speeds, and quickly for large areas, and something that was not required prior to the smartphone. And so one of the arguments that can be made is we would certainly, in this alternative timeline, not see the same need to build out and make investments in the type of wireless data capabilities that exist now in the fourth generation networks, and as we're on the cusp now of fifth generation networks or 5G networks being brought to bear. We would see a very different, much slower growth in terms of the capabilities or needs of those data networks. Now, it's hard to know where that would have been redirected to, because one of the things that definitely happens anytime you have a fork or a change like this is that investment would have gone somewhere. So it might have gone into faster development of fixed broadband, the types of things that we're accustomed to having in terms of DSL and cable-type internet speeds that exist in our homes now. We may have seen the technology to build out those networks expand faster, and the money that was used to build out cellular networks may have been devoted into that, or it may have been devoted into something entirely different. Again, that's one of the things that's tough to know in any alternate timeline is if it didn't go there, what would have been the attractor for that? That investment, the need for investment would have still existed out there, and it would have functioned in a very different way. One of the other just interesting impacts to sort of mention as a side note here is really the impact on the cellular companies that came as a result of this change as well. There had been a fair amount of consolidation in the cellular world throughout the period that led up to the smartphone. Certainly once the networks needed to be more robust, there was much more of a need to have the types of carriers that were able to either pool their aggregate resources to have these types of networks or the larger players. For example, APPtitude, which was one of the major players, along with Singular, one of its components, in 2007, at the time of the smartphone's introduction, the iPhone, grew tremendously as a result of being the exclusive provider of the Apple iPhone. The only place you could get an iPhone there for a brief period of time was actually through AT&T, and that was a big boost to their business. Even once it became available to other providers, though, it quickly became an understanding that those providers needed to be able to have the types of data networks that would support the apps and the new capabilities that were being built there on the smartphone. So in the forked time, you probably would have had a different atmosphere in terms of the types of cellular companies that could and would have survived, because it becomes much more difficult for companies to compete in that space if they aren't able to provide the robust data connectivity as the needs grow beyond that of voice with the smartphone introduction and the rise of the use of apps and the other things that we now do on these portable mobile devices that we call phones. Finally, a thing to consider would be in an alternate timeline without the smartphone is how our society would be different. We now have a new term. Some of you may have heard it. It's known as a smombie. A smombie is somebody who is acting like a zombie because they're using a smartphone. And so it's the person that's walking around paying more attention to their phone than they are to walking or where they're going. One example of just how this has actually impacted society is in Augsburg, Germany. They actually have embedded pedestrian traffic lights in the pavement so that those who are looking at their smartphones when they walk up upon an intersection will notice the fact that they shouldn't proceed forward because it's red. Not because they look up and see a light, but because they're already looking down at their smartphone. And we can all certainly readily recognize how it's very much the common scene now in meetings that we sit in at work or in elevators or any place that we go to see people that are fixated, perhaps to the point of being overly fixated on the device that's in their hand. While we may have seen this to some degree before in the early days of mobile phones with people who were making calls, you didn't see it as much when it was just an email platform. You didn't see it as much when it was just the very basic internet browsing capabilities that existed prior to the smartphone. But the smartphone has the ability to deliver, for example, things like a podcast. I would suspect that the vast majority of the folks that are listening to this podcast are probably listening on a smartphone, on a smart device. And so the ability to stream and to easily download audio through an app was something that didn't exist before the smartphone. Yes, you could do things where you would transfer audio to a PDA type of device. I did that personally. but you downloaded traditionally on a personal computer, a desktop computer, and then you made the transition through a syncing over to the mobile device. Now with ubiquitous, fast, relatively inexpensive, sometimes thought of as almost being free because of Wi-Fi, data capabilities that can be brought to bear for the smartphone, it's changed the way that society works. And so things like listening to music through something like Spotify or Apple Music, something that's actually streaming music, is the result of the smartphone. Podcast, video, the number of people that are able to watch movies and TV shows as they're riding on a bus or as they're just sitting in a public space. All of that is how society has changed. YouTube videos, for example, being much more ubiquitous and easy to share. All of that is a result of smartphone technology. And so while the technology has changed things like business and commerce, we've talked about that already, the other major change that we would see today in a non-smartphone world is we would see just the ways that we interact with each other be different. Be much less the case of sitting at a restaurant with family or friends and having half the people at the table not engaged in conversation but engaged in something they're doing personally on their smartphone, be it playing a game, watching a video, responding to a text, reading an email, ordering the Uber for how they're going to get home after the meeting. All these things that can happen or would be happening in our present society as well as a smartphone would be different. And so one of the arguments that can be made for how the fork would have made things different is we would still have much more, I think, of a personal, interactive social experience. Our social interactions would be now still more face-to-face than they are versus the social interactions that we interact with through our smartphone. In fact, there are a number of studies that talk about just the way that the human body sort of processes and releases endorphins and other chemical changes that happen inside the body which actually make the use of smartphones somewhat addictive. If you look at a number of smartphones that have actually employed the technology now to change the light composition into night modes so that people aren't dealing with the issues of having difficulty falling asleep because they've been impacted by the screen time that they've had within the last hour before trying to fall asleep. All of these things wouldn't exist in that alternative world. We would be talking to each other more, we would be looking at devices less, and we wouldn't be having some of the issues that change the way that people behave that are actually tied to the smartphone itself. Those come with benefits. There's no doubt the smartphone has brought benefits, but they also come with drawbacks. And so recognizing that in the alternate timeline, we would be less dependent upon that technology as a way of interacting with each other. I think one of the things that immediately jumps to mind now is social networking. For example, Facebook being the most prolific of those, I think would be very different without the smartphone. While people certainly were engaged in Facebook, Facebook existed and people do interact with it on a regular computer basis, by far if you look at their usage and metric statistics, you will find that more and more and more Facebook consumption by end users is actually over that smartphone device. And when you factor in that suddenly the smartphone is also a camera, a way to capture video, which then can be uploaded or fed to a social network, again using Facebook as an example, but Twitter and other, Snapchat and the other things as well, you see how this works in a cyclical self-reinforcing cycle. I use Facebook on the phone more because it's handy and available on my smartphone. Because it's handy and available and I have access to a camera, I take more pictures that I upload to Facebook, which means other users that I'm connected to want to see my pictures. They're doing that on a smartphone. So these things have created a symbiotic relationship. The smartphone and the various services and social networks that go with them tied to the technology in such a way that it's altered the way that we interact. You can argue perhaps in some ways that's better, but you see far less person-to-person interaction because the technology has enabled the interaction to be a virtual interaction, or the networking of the social aspect is a social network on a computer versus a social network face-to-face. So in the alternative timeline where the smartphone doesn't rise to the prominence that it is now, you wouldn't see, for example, I think you would, obviously it existed before and would continue to exist, a Facebook, but nowhere to the extent that it is now. Think about the impact of Facebook, whether you consider it to be a good thing or a bad thing, on business, on elections. For example, one of the major controversies in the 2016 United States presidential election was the use of technology, particularly through Facebook, to be able to reach and influence voters. And if you don't have the smartphone making Facebook as ubiquitous as it is, You don't have a ubiquitous Facebook that is capable of having the influence that it does. And that influence is not just on how we connect with our friends and with our family, but that influence is on how we connect with society. And so one of the major differences that would exist in an alternate current version of a smartphone reality is there would be less of that influence that would happen in society. So we would have a little less Facebook, and personally I'll just speak as an editorial comment here that probably would make us a little bit better as a society if we actually had to talk and interact with people versus interacting in a social environment that is by computer and by internet. Of course, as I've already mentioned, the flip side of that would be this medium that we're communicating with now. The fact that I'm now a host of a podcast probably would also not exist in quite the same way if it were in that alternate timeline. So I recognize even the things that I enjoy and that are something that I think are worthwhile and valuable doing, exercising, having a podcast here, the existence of A Fork in Time is also the result of the real timeline. A Fork in Time, the Alternate History podcast, may not exist in a world where there had not been a smartphone. So given that we've sort of turned the topic outside back in upon ourselves in a very personal way, this is probably as good a place as any to sort of bring things to a close. We probably could, I know I certainly probably could go on for probably another hour or so about just the changes that have happened in the last 10 years as a result of this one technology, bringing computing to our hands, bringing portability to our communications beyond that of just being able to make a phone call. The smartphone, without a doubt, has been a technology game changer just in the last 10 plus years, a very short period of time. It's amazing if you actually think through all the ways that it touches and impacts our lives today in a very short period of time, how it has changed things. And it's one of those things of not even knowing what the technology would have been without it. In fact, one of the most interesting things I heard here recently was the fact that, sort of no one knew they needed a smartphone until they saw one, right? I remember actually I was one of the early folks who said, I'm not sure I even need that or want that, and then I had one, and now it's hard to imagine living without it. And so it's been a very impactful piece of technology in a very short period of time. And so if we think about what it would be to not have that, things would be very different today in 2019 than they were. They may be a little bit more like they were in 2007, and that may not necessarily be a bad thing or a good thing, but it would certainly be a different thing. So once again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. If you are new to the podcast, we want to say welcome. If you've been around for a while, we want to say thank you. And we hope that you continue to be part of what we're doing here and join the community that is represented by A Fork in Time. Just as we close out here, a reminder that one of the ways that you can learn more about who we are and interact with us is actually via our website. That's at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. The A on the front, the podcast before the .com, both are important to get you to the right place. There you can find the complete archive of our shows. There you can find the ability to give us feedback. You can also provide suggestions or comments related to episodes. In addition to that, you can also join and be updated when we have new releases or new information to push out as well. So if you're new to the podcast, want to learn a little bit more about who we are and interact with us, we encourage you to go to our website there at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. You can also interact with us on social media. There on the website, you'll see links to various ways that you can connect with us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Pinterest, the other social media outlets that exist. One of the things you can do for us that would be very helpful, we ask for this somewhat frequently, we don't do it every time, is you probably use a podcatcher of some variety, maybe to subscribe to the show if you're a regular listener. You can do us a great favor by going and leaving a review or a rating at those sites that allow you to do that, places like Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, a number of the different mechanisms by which people get our podcast allow you to leave ratings and feedback. Those help because that helps other listeners who might be interested in what we do find us on the various search engines that exist there on those sites and also in general on the internet. So one of the ways that you can help promote the podcast and help us grow is just by leaving a review or placing a rating on where you actually get the podcast from. And of course, the last thing that I would mention there that you can do, and you can find a link to this on our website, is connect to us via Patreon. Patreon is a mechanism that allows folks who want to support artists in various endeavors to do so. I don't think of what we do here as being art. but there are some costs associated with producing and hosting and distributing the podcast. And so if you'd like to be a part of the podcast, assuming you're able, you can go there and learn what it means to become either a supporter or a patron of our services via Patreon through a small commitment each month. Certainly don't feel obligated to do that unless it's something that you can do and want to do, but we certainly would appreciate that as well. And we do give some special perks to those who connect with us on Patreon and support the podcast in that way. For example, preferential treatment on suggested topics, and also the ability to become a guest host on the podcast. And so if you are so inclined to do so, we would invite you to check us out there. But most importantly, we just thank you for the gift of your time, as we always do. We know that that's one of the most valuable things that you can do. And so as we conclude this particular episode, we'll say thank you and look forward to interacting with you next time. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Join us next time.